What is going on, guys? Welcome back to the Yu-Gi-Oh journey. I know that it's been quite a long time since I've uploaded. A lot of my weekends have been going toward either playing Yu-Gi-Oh like at live events or even like remote duels, things like that, or like spending time with some friends and family, things like that, maybe getting some extra stuff done for work, etc. So I've been a little bit busy on the weekends, which is usually when I record my videos. But now here we are, we're back, and I think I have a really good video for you guys. I want to go over how I think you can improve on playing your deck to be able to take it to like the next level, or just have some other things in the back of your mind that you're thinking about. That way when you're playing, you can look out for certain things or be able to like read your opponent a little bit better and be able to pick up on very subtle cues to be able to win, or take some information that you know from the meta and be able to apply it to the current game. So as of right now, we have pretty much two kind of main deck types, and one is control, the other is combo. And those two types are pretty much exactly what they sound like. Control focuses on being able to control the game state and slowing down your opponent to kind of play at your speed. Meanwhile, you're gaining advantage and keeping up card advantage and things like that. Whereas with combo, you're pretty much just trying to go through an entire combo and basically end on a board where it's really hard for your opponent to play through, and be able to basically stop whatever they want to do at the end of your turn, or if you're going second, to basically be able to break an opponent's board and then basically go into your own and kind of win the game from there. So keeping up tempo essentially. And there's also floodgate players, but we don't really talk about those guys. No, I'm just kidding. Floodgate is kind of an extreme version of control. Personally, not my favorite type of deck. Basically, your entire point is to basically kind of slow burn your opponent, whether it be through like, burner cards or just attacking. While meanwhile, your opponent can't really do anything, so you're playing different cards. Like there can be only one. Basically, stopping your opponent from being able to play at all. I'm not going to talk too much about floodgate because it's really just kind of the same thing where like you're just basically trying to set up your floodgate, and then that's basically like your win condition, whether it be like Mystic Mine, Tikaboo, maybe some type of like special summon stopper like Arc Lord Christia, something like that. But as for the other two, there are a lot of like subtle cues that you can pick up from your opponent to be able to help you play better, or be able to play around certain things that maybe you weren't playing around before. I'll just jump on into it, but before I do, please like and subscribe down below. Helps me out a lot with continuing the channel's progress, as well as helps to make the channel more accessible to others and be able to help out other players as well. And if you already are subscribed and you want to get notified whenever I upload something, definitely click the bell down below as well. That way the next time I upload a tips video, then you can take a look at it right away and apply it at your next local. I'll just start off with combo because I feel like it's kind of easier to go from there than talk about control. Like I mentioned, with combo, the whole point is to basically put up an entire board that's going to be really hard for your opponent to out. Some of the weaknesses of combo decks though are that they usually have like 1 or 2 points somewhere along the combo where if they get stopped there, it's either very detrimental to the combo, or it hurts them enough to where like it'll change how they have to get to their end board, or if they'll even end on the same end board at all. So the important thing for a combo player is to understand where those choke points are and be able to protect those as much as possible. One really good example of this is Pack's Prank Kids deck, which just recently won the most recent YCS. So with that deck, while I wouldn't necessarily call it a combo deck, there is a very weak point in Prank Kids, and that's the first link summon that you do. The Prank Kid effect that you're activating in the graveyard to special summon another one is pretty much the weakest point of the combo, aside from maybe like Doodle Doo. And if that gets stopped, a lot of the time that kind of just ends their turn. So the way that Pack got around this is he was running Parallel Exceed, and so that way he could actually chain block his whatever Prank Kid monster he had, because he could, once he link summon the monster, he could activate the Prank Kid monster as chain link 1, and then Parallel Exceed as chain link 2, which allows his Prank Kid monster to be protected from something like Ash. So setting up your chain links correctly is one of the, I'd say, easier things to do, and one of the best ways to help protect you against getting hit by certain hand traps. There are some decks that really can't get around this though, unfortunately, so it's a little bit difficult. However, there are some other precautions you can take, such as like baiting your opponent to see if you can try to out some of the other hand traps before they hit like an essential part of your combo. A good example of this is something like, let's say you're playing Drytrons. So with Drytrons, you typically need to open, well, 1 for sure, but typically 2 Drytrons to be able to start comboing off. And if you don't, then you're kind of screwed. So for example, if you have a hand that's something like Drytron Nova and like Diviner of the Herald, the other card in your hand is maybe like a more bricky like ritual monster, like maybe a Herald of Ultimateness or Edatin or something like that. So you really want to get off the Drytron monster summon in this instance, because first of all, it gets you any Drytron monster. Second of all, Herald activating and like searching you something like either the ritual spell or like some other ritual monster really doesn't do anything for you if you don't have a Drytron. So in that instance, I'd probably just normal summon the Herald first to try to bait out an Ash, because I need this Drytron Nova to resolve in order for me to continue my combo. This kind of brings me into my next point with combo decks, is knowing what hand traps are in the format currently, which which decks are typically playing which hand traps, or just which hand traps are really popular in the main deck right now. There are very few decks that will main deck Nibiru right now. Prank Kids maybe, something like that, maybe even like Shadalls or something, but the majority decks just aren't main decking Nibiru right now just because the format doesn't really call for it. And that's important to know because, like, for example, if you are playing a combo deck and you open a hand that's really weak to Nibiru, it is important to note that, but it might not be important for you to play around Nibiru and go like maybe a separate combo route that you might go through to play around Nibiru if it's like game 1. You might be thinking, well, like, wasn't it just important to always play around Nibiru? Yes, but a lot of the time when you're playing around Nibiru, your combo is a bit weaker in some other points, and if your opponent takes advantage of that with something like an Ash Blossom, which is obviously run in almost every single deck, then you could end up losing that duel just because you try to play around a card they didn't have. Now, obviously, games 2 and 3, this is a little bit different. If you notice that your hand is weak to Nibiru, then you definitely want to go the anti-Nibiru route, because there's a good chance if you're playing a combo deck that they might have Nibiru in the side. Another thing to note about hand traps as well is that you can usually get a lot of information on what your opponent is playing just by the hand traps that they play. Obviously, Ash is very generic and almost every deck plays it, so you're not going to get a lot of information from there. However, if somebody Ashes one of your cards, there's a really strong chance they're not playing Drytrons. Most Drytron decks do not play Ash in the main. Also, a really strong tell for certain decks are just through the hand traps. So, for example, a lot of the time, if I'm going through my combo and I get like Gamut or something like that, there's a strong chance that my opponent is playing something like Tri-Brigade, maybe Prank Kids, maybe something like Shadalls, something along those lines. Because those are the decks that usually fit in Gamma. There's a good chance I'm not playing against something like Striker or anything like that, because usually most Striker decks don't play Gamma. So I can kind of narrow down which deck I might be playing against game 1, just depending on what kind of hand trap they're using. Then of course there's the obvious, if you get Herald of Orange Light, you're obviously playing against Drytron, but that's totally different. So it helps you kind of narrow down what you might be playing against. Also, a really important thing too is, especially if you're a combo player and you've ever had the situation where like, or if this just happens very often where you're playing a match and you go into time, then that just means that you don't know your deck well enough to be able to play around hand traps or to be able to come to the most optimal conclusion after getting hand trapped. You might be thinking like, well, what does that mean? So usually when most combo players are playtesting, they usually just playtest just by themselves, right? So like they'll kind of run through the combo, make sure they understand the combo, which parts to go through, and you might have an idea of what part of your combo is more likely to get hit, or which part of your combo more likely will hurt you if you do get hit, which is really good. However, your opponent might not know, and they might hit you at like a random part in the combo, or they might hit you at like a spot where you didn't realize was really weak, but actually is. So what are some ways to prepare for that? Well, when you're playtesting, it's important to play against, at least I would say, about 2 hand traps, like Ash and Valor, or something like Ash and Imperm, something along those lines, because most decks are going to be running some type of combination of those type of hand traps, and be really good to be able to know where your combo goes from there if that happens. For example, I've been playing Drytrons a lot recently. Looking at an opening hand, I can already basically tell you like where the hand's going to go if I get hit with what hand trap where. And that's really helpful because it helps my turn stay somewhere in between 5 to 7 minutes, even if I go full combo, because I'm waiting to see if I get hand trapped. Because if I get hand trapped somewhere, then I have to switch gears to like, okay, and now I have to kind of go down this path to kind of recuperate and go back to where I needed to go to finish off the combo. So that's really important, because if you're just playing the combo deck, you're just playing it through every time, yes, that's good for knowing the combo, but it's not good because the minute you get hit with a hand trap or some type of disruption, you're not going to know where to go. You're going to sit there for a couple minutes trying to figure it out. You're going to go into time, and then you might even get like a game loss because you're taking too long to try to figure it out. Not to mention, if you're playing against a control deck, depending on the player, they might take a little bit more time to kind of analyze the situation and then decide on how they want to react, especially if they're playing like a back row heavy deck. In which case, you want to kind of prepare for that. And so you want to give your opponent ample time to respond. Obviously not too much, because then they're slow playing, right? But you also want to make sure that, given that your opponent has responses, that you have enough time to go through your combo and be able to win, just because you know the routes of your combo very well. And then there's the control players. They have a very different job compared to combo players. They basically have to know the majority of the meta decks inside and out, and they have to basically know when to disrupt those decks. And that's important for a control player because it's their job to slow down their opponent to play at a certain tempo, and then basically gain advantage because their deck plays at that tempo very well, meanwhile the opponent's does not. Another thing to note too as a control player is that if you do stop your opponent at a certain point in the combo, you have to be able to kind of see ahead, kind of based on how many cards they have, what cards they've used so far, and be able to see ahead and determine, okay, based on what I've seen so far, if I stop this here, how much further in the combo can they go, and what are they probably going to end on if I stop it here? Granted, that doesn't always happen how you want it, of course, because of course they might have some like weird extender in their hand or whatever, but you should have like a general idea, and then use that knowledge to kind of pinpoint where you want to stop your opponent, But the cool thing about a control player's job is that if you hit the wrong thing, you're gonna pretty much know immediately. So if you hit like the wrong card and then your opponent still goes like full combo, you know, okay, stopping that there does nothing, so now I know for next time. Getting that knowledge is really important for knowing where to stop decks and be able to stop your opponent. That way when it's your turn, or if you are going first and they're going second, that way you can just continue to keep them at your tempo and then basically just win off of card advantage. Another thing to be wary of as a control player too is that there are cards that are designed to stop you from disrupting your opponent. For example, Call by the Grave, Triple Tactics Talents, you know, other cards like that. That's very important to know, because if you stop your opponent, and then by you stopping your opponent there, you've triggered their Triple Tactics Talents, and you realize that, you know, they can either look at your hand or draw more cards, and you're not prepared to handle that, then you're in a really bad situation just by trying to stop your opponent, even if it was the right spot. One really good example of this is that like pretty much most Drytron decks are running Triple Tactics Talents nowadays, just because it's a fantastic extender for them. Or if they do get drolled, they get to see your hand, and they're usually just going to end on Dragoon anyway. A really strong example of this is, let's say you have something like Ash Blossom, Forbidden Droplet, which would stop the Dragoon, or you know, whatever other card they might have, and then 3 other cards in hand. If you decide to Ash your opponent and then think like, okay, I have Droplet for the Dragoon, so I should be fine, and then your opponent activates Triple Tactics Talents to see your hand and send a card back, now they just sent back your Forbidden Droplet back to the deck, and they make Dragoon, and they just basically overtake you in advantage because your other 3 cards don't deal with Dragoon, then you just misplayed by trying to stop them, thinking that you had the upper hand, but you didn't take account of like the cards that they might have in their hand to prevent you from stopping them, which sounds kind of like control inception. Basically, if you can't stop their follow-up, then it might not be worth it to try to stop that play. So for example, in that specific situation, you're probably better off just letting that person go full combo and then just using droplets on your turn to just basically get rid of the rest of their board. Because the Ash wasn't really going to do much for you anyway, most likely. Then the Ash can also just feed in as more cost for droplets to be able to negate more things. So rather than trying to take it as like a 1-for-1, you can just basically use it to help wipe their board. Something really important to note as a control player as well is that be wary that if you are playing against a deck that tends to run Gamma in the main deck, be very cautious about hand trapping them with the monster effect when they have no monsters on the field. Like as a Dino player, I would usually try to bait out a lot of people by sending Mist to the graveyard as like my first action if I had Gamma in hand. That way I either try to force out the Lancia, which I can negate with Gamma, or if I activate the miscellaneous effect to banish and then special summon, then I can bait out an Ash, and then from there I can just Gamma that because I still have no monsters on board, and I can just basically get some free advantage off of that. Some ways to work around that might be something like, if you're more scared of like the UCT than anything else, then just saving Ash for the double evolution pill. In that situation, unless they have like Dolka on board, they're probably not going to be able to stop the negation of the double evolution pill. So just be wary of the different countermeasures your opponent might have to stop your disruptions. Yu-Gi-Oh is really fun because there's a lot of counterplay to it. So for example, you have to kind of predict what your opponent has and how you can disrupt them on, you know, either your turn or their turn. There's like a lot of back and forth, which is really cool. And it's one of the reasons why I really love the game. However, it can kind of create a lot of confusing scenarios, and especially in trying to figure out when the right time to do something is. However, one really good tactic you can use is that, like, if you're like a combo player, you can always ask the control player, like, hey, if I would have done this instead, like, where would you have activated this or done this differently? That way you can get an idea of kind of what they're thinking of and get an idea of how you can reroute your combo to be able to avoid those certain pitfalls. And as a control player, it's really easy to ask your opponent, especially after the match ends, like, hey, if I would have ashed this card instead, would that have hurt you more? A lot of time people will be very open and be like, yeah, that, you know, that might have hurt the deck a lot more, or like, no, not really, I think what you did was the right spot, but you know, I had this extender, which, you know, if I didn't have this, then I would have lost. Now as a control player, you know for next time, okay, this was the right spot to hit, but just be wary that they may have an extender. I know a lot of this was very vague as well, so it's kind of hard to give like a lot of specific examples unless like you're talking about specific decks going against each other or specific interactions and things like that, especially because it's so random on what you could draw and how many hand traps you might be playing versus how many hand traps you might side in, etc. And so if you guys have any particular questions, feel free to leave them down in the comments, or you want me to make a video of maybe going through a particular type of deck's opening hands and kind of seeing like where I would go from there depending on like which hand traps I might run into and things like that. I can always make a video like that as well. If you feel like that's helpful, definitely feel free to let me know in the comments down below. But other than that, that's pretty much it. Hope you guys liked the video. Please like and subscribe if you did, and I'll see you guys on the next one.